And we should be live. Hello, my name is Lachlan. This is Phil. We're coming live to you from CameraPro Brisbane office. Welcome to Beginner's
Guide to Landscape with Olympus. That's the one.
Right.
And today we have Aaron from Olympus with us. And so I'll let Aaron introduce a little bit about what he does with Olympus, and he can explain a little bit more about the presentation that's coming up, and then we'll have Q&A at the end as well.
Right. So welcome and thank you very much for joining us. So my name is Aaron. I'm the Product and Education Specialist for Olympus. I'm based down in Sydney, and it's absolutely my pleasure to be here in partnership with CameraPro to bring this Beginner's Guide to Landscape to you guys. It's really important, some of the things that we're going to cover and the things that we need to keep in mind before we even get to our location. But I really hope we're going to be as comprehensive as we can tonight, but I have no doubt that we'll have some questions, and we've got lots of time for Q&A after the session as well. So as we go through, if you've got any questions, then please, the guys can manage the questions if they're sort of on the subject that we're talking about at the time. If it's a little bit off topic, or if it's a little bit more long-winded that you think might require a more complicated answer, we might leave it until the end of Q&A, because again, we'll have the time to do that. So
yeah, happy to field some questions at the end.
Fantastic. Thank you guys. All right, so just a quick overview of the topics that we're going to be covering this evening, folks, is so starting with goals of our landscape photography. So the things that we want to keep in mind and how we're actually going to achieve better results on the back of that. Next, incredibly important and probably not talked about enough, is timing in landscape. So we're not just talking about times of day, we're talking about patience as well. Our compositional elements, so how we can put things together within our frames in order to make our images look a lot more interesting than the standard, postcode photos, or what I like to call landscape passport photos, which is obviously what we want to avoid. And also filters and file formats. So again, the things that form part of the tools that we're going to need in order to achieve the results that we want, and also what we're going to do with those files and how we're going to get the most out of those once we've actually captured. So let's start with our goals. So the first thing we want to do is take our reader on a journey. And the best way that we can do that is actually turning our 2D images into 3D to make them automatically more interesting. We also want to bring some order to the chaos. Now, when we're shooting landscapes, obviously nature, it can be completely chaotic, but it's all about guiding that reader or the viewer through that image the way that we want them to perceive through it. It's also finding the extraordinary out of the ordinary as well. And we'll give you some tips on how to instantly change the way that your images are going to be perceived, just by tweaking a couple of little things that you might not have thought of before. So to begin with, so we want to take our reader on a journey. So in landscape photography, as with many other genres of photography, our goal is to transport the reader to another place. We want them to be there with us. We want to, feel that warm kiss of the sun as the sun's setting, as we're walking on a beautiful beach. As we take them on that journey, they're going to appreciate our photo, but we also want them to guide through the photo the way that we want them to perceive that image as well. So one of the things that we can do with that, and to automatically create more interest within our photographs, is again to create that three-dimensionality to our shots. And it's very easy to do if we're focusing on our foreground, our middle ground, and our background. Now here you've got a beautiful shot here of some sea baths. And as you can see, we're sort of focused and we're led down that path into that beautiful pool. But then as we go through that pool, we're sort of led into that beautiful seascape in the background, and we're taken on that journey very easily because we're starting from front to back, but that's the way that image was put together in order to guide us through that image. So the first thing I want you to be considerate of is those three parts of your image, is your foreground, your background, and obviously your middle ground. Now, another great way to render our images into three-dimensionality is to use leading lines. So I'll talk a little bit more about the narrative and what we're actually trying to say with our images a little bit later on. But a big part of that is using leading lines to go through the image, but we also want to create that narrative to where is that going to, what journey can I actually be taken on, and what's going to be on the other side of what I can't see. And leading lines, whether they're man-made or whether they've been manufactured by nature, it's still a great way, but we've got to take that perception and guide. Next, very, very simple thing to do, and again, they can either be man-made or they can be through nature, is to use a frame within a frame. So here we've got a beautiful example of using some hedges and then our beautiful scenery in the background. Now that was manufactured for us, but there are other ways that we can do this by creating something that we either carry around with us or, you know, thinking outside the square a little bit to create that higher level of interest within the image that we're capturing. And as we talked about before, and here's another beautiful example of lines and patterns. So here we've actually got both of those working together for us. We've got that beautiful leading line of that of the bridge going away from us, but we've also got a pattern created by the way that bridge is structured as well. So you'll find as we go through these that the combination of these things that bring order to chaos or guide the viewer through the image, the more that they have in there, and they have to be subtle when they're combined, but that is how you turn an ordinary image into something extraordinary when you've got these things in mind. Another great way to bring order to chaos is the movement or the sensation of movement within our shots. So whether it be moving water, people, any of those sorts of things, it automatically creates a much different feel to the image before we even start. So we'll talk about how we can create these a little bit later with longer shutter speeds. But again, any sort of sensation of movement within our shot is going to automatically make it more interesting. Another thing that we want to talk about that, again, probably isn't focused on enough is using color saturation. Now, it could be completely desaturating, or it could be using what we call opposing tones. So what we here, we've got a representation of what you can also find under Adobe for the Adobe color wheel. If you look that up, you can just search Adobe color wheel. You'll see something similar to this, but it actually gives you a guide that you can manipulate and move in saturation and tone to show you what those opposing colors are. So if we started off with something yellow, we're going to be looking at something violet, which is an opposing color, but what they actually do is complement each other. And I've got some examples of that here. So with red, it's green and vice versa. And then also with orange, we've got blue. Okay, so if you've never seen this sort of thing before, we could talk all night on this particular subject, but it's probably easier to show you some examples of this as opposed to just using the color wheel. So here we've got a beautifully lit bridge that we've got some really warm orange light coming through, and the contrast that creates against that beautiful blue sky really does enhance that image as opposed to leaving that bridge very black and dark and just having the church lit up in the background. Again, we're using those colors to our advantage. The other alternative is obviously we can go in the other far extreme and completely desaturate. And when we do that, what we're actually doing is using those beautiful contrasts that we've got in here as well. So you can see those beautiful highlights and those beautiful shadows as well. Now, you can completely ruin an image by, in my opinion anyway, by if you do shoot it in black and white and really pulling your highlights and shadows in the opposite direction. What I mean by that is that making those shadows nearly completely black or making those highlights nearly completely white. Because if you do that, yes, you'll have a very high contrast image, which is what you were trying to do. But what you'll actually do is pull out all the subtlety and all of the detail out in those shadow areas as well as those brightened areas if you do that. So if we are looking to shoot something in black and white to create that contrast, you've still got to be a little bit careful of how far you push that, because you will actually end up spoiling some of the beautiful detail that you might find, especially within your midtones. Also, our eyes look for shapes, so we should be using shapes and structures when we're there. Now, it doesn't have to be something as iconic as the Eiffel Tower as to what we've got here, but what you'll also notice here, if we've got that shape and structure, but we're also got that beautiful canopy creating that frame within a frame. So automatically we're creating two of those things or points of interest that we're going to have within our shot to make it even more interesting again. Also, structure. So we're going to talk quite heavily on grids and golden rules a little bit later on, but it is a great way to bring chaos and balance to our image. So here we've got a very easy representation of the rule of thirds grid, how we're putting our points of interest on those, but I'll actually go into a lot more detail on that as well. I just wanted to give you sort of an opening example of what we're talking about. So really, folks, all we're trying to do with all of these is to guide the person through our image, and we can use all of those different elements in order to do that. And when it's done well, here's a beautiful example of what we can do. So this is actually captured by an Olympus visionary by the name of Chris Earwalker. If you're not familiar with his work, he's a phenomenal photographer and videographer. And this is from a couple of years ago. So some of you might be familiar with that, some of the mountain range in the back of this scene here. So this is in Yosemite over in the States. And apparently this is an incredibly iconic place to take photographs, probably for this reason. So instead of making this particular image just a nice guided shot where we're sort of following the flow of the road and then going out into that beautiful mountain scene, simply by putting a subject in there, we're not only creating a point of interest, but we're also creating a little bit of sense of scale as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in more detail, but simply by adding things and components to your image like that actually make a large space appear even larger, because you can actually see that subject in contrast to the rest of it. One thing that has been incredibly popular over the sort of the last 5-6 years is throwing people in sort of wet or waterfall environments and throwing somebody in a yellow or a red jacket in there. If you plan on doing that again, maybe pick a different color, because that's actually being done to death now. We really don't want to see any more of those. And again, the whole point of making something interesting is not you take cues from other photographers that influence you, but you don't want to simply replicate everything that somebody's already done, because again, you've already seen it and so have other people as well. So next step is finding the ordinary out of it, or extraordinary out of ordinary, I should say. So we all want that postcard shot, but we've also all seen the postcard. So you want to find a different angle of view that gives a unique perspective and allows people who are familiar with the scene to get a completely different appreciation for it. One actually example of this that just popped into mind is some of you folks might have done workshops with a gentleman by the name of Matt Crummins before. Matt's a phenomenally talented photographer from Victoria, and I went shooting with him not long actually after I sort of started getting into the training side with Olympus, and we went down to the pier at St Kilda, and he said, okay, cool, so we've got these beautiful lines of pier, how are we going to make this more interesting? And I did what a lot of people I think do when you first see a scene. You sort of think left to right or right to left. But what you really should be doing, and the way you're actually really going to make an impact on your perspective, is actually to think from top to bottom. So, and I don't mean just taking that one image that's, you know, down a little bit lower than eye line or one a little bit higher. Tweak it. Take 20 different images all at different alignments, because you'll be genuinely blown away about how much of a difference that makes. And the main reason for it is that we're changing that perspective. We're not looking at it at the same level as what somebody who is simply standing there is looking at it. So that getting away from that eye line, from what I like to call it, is actually one of the first big steps of changing that perspective. It's a very simple thing to do, but it really does make a big difference to the impact that your image is going to make, especially when it's something that is very regularly photographed from a particular angle or a particular direction. So first things first, that's a great way to do that. So here's another great example. So my colleague Carl actually shot this, I believe, over in South Africa. Most people would take this perspective from the bridge down as opposed to the bridge up. So sometimes you've got to be a little bit daring. Please don't ever put yourself in peril. I'm not telling you to do that. Don't tell the person on the helicopter that's choppering you out of somewhere that Aaron from Olympus said, I need to go and put myself at harm's way. Please don't do that. But really, I guess what I'm saying is that give yourself the opportunity to create a unique perspective. And again, that's a great way to capture something that's eye-catching and different. Something as an example here. So everybody's sort of seeing this perspective from the London Eye because it's an unobstructed view. So most people are going to say, okay, that's the best way to shoot it. Think differently. Think completely different perspective, and it's actually going to make it, even if it's not necessarily better, it's going to make it a little bit more unique compared to the way that people would either normally perceive it or the way it's normally photographed. Otherwise, you can do, again, this is a Chris Earwalker shot as well. If you're lucky enough, put yourself in a beautiful spot where you've got these sorts of views all around you, and it's pretty hard to not take a spectacular photograph. I think you'll agree. That's absolutely stunning.
Yeah. It's a beautiful composition.
Yeah, absolutely. So next, we're going to move on to timing in landscape photography. So again, this is incredibly important. I'm going to talk to you about why. Starting off with pre-visualization. So again, thinking about what we want to achieve before we get to a particular site. Patience, incredibly important. And I know that's something that I really don't possess in life, but I've got 2 kids now. So I've got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. And if it hasn't taught me patience, I'm not really sure what else you would call it. Maybe endurance, I'm not really sure. But patience in landscape photography is incredibly important, and I'll give you, again, some great examples as to why it should be. And then we'll talk about scattering of light or scattering of elements and the effect that actually has on our light, because, again, it's incredibly important. So as an example, again, I've taken one of Chris's shots because this is actually a bucket list place for me. I actually really, really want to go to Yosemite and take some of these shots, or not exactly the same shots. But I think this is a great example of something that, again, like we talked about before, by putting somebody in the foreground, it actually creates a sense of scale. And that scale actually adds to the level of openness and grandness of scale of the rest of the shot. So yes, they could have just taken this shot from this particular perspective, and we all would have agreed that it was beautiful. But purely by making that pre-visualized choice of putting somebody within our foreground automatically creates that change that we're looking for and makes something a little bit more interesting. So at least the subject's not wearing a red or a yellow raincoat, which is good because it would have looked kind of silly because there's no rain there, obviously. But again, great sense of scale purely by making that little bit of a pre-visualized choice. So big part of pre-visualization is your location. So I'm not just talking about, looking at things on a map and saying, oh, there's a look out there and that sort of thing. Actually do some homework. So either look at other images that have been captured there and say, okay, I want to take something similar to that, but I want to make it obviously a little bit different. Hopefully we can give you the tools to do that. But pre-scouting your location is incredibly important. And obviously that's taking weather elements and that sort of thing into consideration as well. Next is your equipment. The last thing you want to do is to get to the location and find that you've left your filters at home or your tripod or something like that. Big tip, especially when you're using tripods, and hopefully not all of you have made this mistake. And I didn't actually really make the mistake. It was actually made for me. So I took one of the tripods here from the office when we were going out for a shoot out in the Blue Mountains near Katoomba, and got all the way out there, pulled the tripod out, went to put my camera on it, and somebody had taken the plate off it. Now, you can imagine that some of the language that would have come out of my mouth at that particular moment. But something simple like that. Now, look, we faked it because we were able to sort of do some other stuff with it. So it was okay in the end. But again, something completely simple about that was not part of my preparation. I didn't prepare properly, but it's a very simple thing that you can do as part of that gear prep. If you only have one camera body, and like most of us do, there's nothing wrong with leaving it on there all of the time, because at least that way you know it's always going to be on there. But if you happen to share cameras, or if you have multiple bodies and only one tripod, definitely make sure that you check whether that plate's either on your camera or on your tripod. Your camera settings. So we'll talk about how some images are captured and that sort of thing as well. But realistically, it's about creating the image the way that you want it to be perceived. It's not. So again, as a great example, I was part of the Bright Festival of Photography that was online over the weekend. And quite a few of the sessions that they look at an image, and one of the questions that come through is, what were the settings that you used for that? And there's nothing wrong with asking that, because it's all part of our learning process, isn't it? We want to say, okay, well, this is how this is sort of captured, and give ourselves sort of a baseline. But really, unless you're in that particular spot at that time of day, in that particular moment with that particular cloud cover, you're not going to be able to replicate that shot simply by putting the camera on those particular settings again. So be cognizant of the fact that and know your camera, I guess, is the best way, and know the lens that you're shooting with it as well, and how to get the most out of it. And that's really what I mean by camera settings. Timing. So again, that's a big part of our location scouting, is actually getting our timing right. So what time of day do we want to be there? Also, what time of year we want to be there as well. So we don't want to turn up, midwinter where it's freezing cold and all of a sudden there's absolutely no light. Now, you probably knew that before you were going to get there, but I know that people do make that mistake, that they don't sort of have that thought process ahead of time of not just time of day, but again, potentially the time of year. And obviously that comes into play when we talk astrophotography as well, when we're shooting the Milky Way. So have that final image in mind before you even take that camera out of the bag is a starting point. And all I'm saying is a starting point, and I'll show you why. It's not the be all and end all, but it's actually it almost makes you a little bit more disciplined. It makes you sort of go, okay, this is what I have in mind. And there's nothing wrong with having some subtle variations on that. But if you set out with a task and you nail it, or get it as close as you can in that particular moment that you're there, you can be pretty proud of yourself because you did exactly what you set out to do. But what you also need to do is not put the blinkers on. You want to make sure that you're completely eyes open 100% of the time. And I'll show you why in a sec. So Obviously, traveling light is something that is incredibly important as well, especially the older that we get. Luckily, I don't have to carry nappy bags on top of all my gear and all that sort of thing anymore. But traveling light is definitely, especially when you're going to get out and about, is definitely the key. And having obviously a small light camera system is great, but obviously having a really portable tripod on there. And the guys from CameraPro have obviously got everything that you need out of that. But once you actually get to your location, again, a big part of that pre-visualization is patience. So actually reading our scene, reading our light, watching cloud cover, all that sort of thing is going to get us a better result. So a very, very famous photographer by the name of Joe McNally is credited with the quote of, "Don't pack up your camera until you've left your location." And these are the true to life examples that I'm going to give you of that, because the changing light can give you a spectacular range of different images from exactly the same spot. Check this out. So my colleague Carl was lucky enough. So this happened right as COVID was hitting in 2020. I got the call the day before that we were supposed to go that I wasn't able to go. So again, you can imagine the choice words that were part of my vocabulary at the time. But very, very proud of the images that the guys were able to capture over there. So these 4 images I'm going to show you. So this is the scene where they were. So this is over in the game reserve in South Africa. So these are no filters. These are all JPEG straight out of camera, and it's all natural changing light, from exactly the same spot, just shot in different directions. So here we go. Yeah, that's starting to get some nice golden glow to it. That's looking pretty nice. Oh, okay. Now we've got some beautiful scattering there, and we've got some beautiful pinks. And then look at what it's faded to there as well. So again, very, very quick and easy example of always be ready to shoot. So as Joe said, and Joe knows a lot better than I do, never put your gear or your camera away. So never even take it off its tripod until you know you're actually physically putting it in the car, because you never know what you're going to see. So again, pre-visualization takes a big chunk of that, but being ready to shoot and capture something as you see it is obviously another big part of that as well. So next, Michael Freeman. If you guys haven't heard of Michael Freeman before or seen his book, Capturing Light at the Heart of Photography, it's a great read. It's not overly cheap, but it's definitely something, especially from a landscape photographer's point of view, that you might be interested in. But brilliant quote from this is that in almost all photography, it's the quality of the light that makes or breaks the shot. So for professional photographers, chasing that light, waiting for it, and sometimes helping it, and finally the capturing of it, is the constant preoccupation, and for some it becomes an obsession. So always pay attention to what your light is doing, and always be prepared to capture that shot. And a big part of that is actually the scattering of light. So it's a phenomenon where light rays get deviated from a straight path on striking obstacles like dust and gas molecules, or even water vapor. So that scattering of light gives it as much spectacular phenomena as the Tyndall effect. So again, I'm not going to go into the big physics lesson on that. But really what we need to be mindful of is, again, what that time of day is actually going to do for us and the way that the light is going to be scattered. So times of day. So this is where our timing plays a really, really big part here. So when we're talking daytime, we're talking about where the sun is 6 degrees or above the axis of the horizon. Once we move into golden hour, that's where we're at 6 degrees and then moving down to the horizon. And then on horizon, obviously, we're at 0 degrees. Then we move on to civil twilight, which is starting to dip below, so up to 6 degrees below that horizon. Then we've got nautical twilight even further down, and then astronomical twilight, which is actually quite a small window, astronomical twilight even further, and then we switch over to night. Okay, so when we're thinking of these times, these are the things that we need to be considerate of. But as you'll see by some of the examples here, those last moments of the day are actually the best times to shoot, and the best times that we're going to get the most spectacular scatterings of light. Now, daytime. So I've been down to the canola fields. I went down there, was it last year or the year before? And I was, from where I am in Sydney, it's probably a 4-hour drive there or thereabouts. So I got there sort of in the afternoon-ish, but then I had to come home because one of my kids was ill. So again, I never catch a break, unfortunately. But look, I was able to take some spectacular shots during the day because there was these sorts of smatterings of cloud. The contrast of that blue sky against the beautiful yellow canola, really just those things in itself can create some beautiful patterns. But again, it's extremely high contrast. It's probably unless you've got something to diffuse or to pattern your light, it's probably the worst time of day for us as landscape photographers, because we're going to create those really high contrasts. But
Hey, Aaron,
sometimes,
just
again,
quickly,
yeah.
just while you're on the just while we were talking about time, we've actually got a really good question from Is there a good from Ash? Sorry, is there a good app to check for these based on your location? So looking at time based.
Yeah, there definitely is. I don't have it in this presentation. I'll need to look it up for you before we finish, or actually, you guys might be able to look that up while we're going through the session. There's a really good Astro one that my colleague Jack Ham used to use, and I'm pretty sure that had daytime component to it as well. It wasn't just an Astro one. So apologies, I can't think of what the name of it is off the top of my head, but absolutely there is. And also it's probably even more important if you've got a distance to travel as well. You want to make sure that you're reading not just the Bureau of Meteorology sort of reading, because that can be sort of sketchy at best. But having those things that are probably more geared towards time of year and season, that's definitely what you want to be looking for as well. So apologies for not having that off the top of my head, but gentlemen, if you wouldn't mind looking that up for us as we go, that would be brilliant.
Ephemeris?
Say that again?
Photo ephemeris?
That's not the one that it's off the top of my head, but if that's coming up in your search, then I'm sure
that's
that would be.
That's come up. That's a few people suggesting. Yeah.
Oh, okay, fantastic. All right, perfect. So next we move on to golden hour. So golden hour is the period of time where the color of the sky grows into that reddy, beautiful orange and gives us those beautiful golden tones. The light is soft and diffused, and with little contrast, since the sun is so low in the sky. So due to the type of light that exists during this golden hour, it doesn't produce strong shadows or harsh lighting. So it's actually really ideal for our landscape photography, not just from a color point of view, because again, we can obviously get some beautiful colors out of it, but that diffusion that happens at that particular time of day really does create some beautiful effect. From there, we move into blue hour or civil twilight. So the sky has that beautiful deep blue hue. It does have a cold color temperature, but it does really provide us with beautiful saturated colors. So those deep blue hues are mixed in with some of the orange, depending on the positioning of the sun or the reflection of the sun. And it's ideal for landscape photography because of the different shades of the sky and also the color saturation that it creates. Here you've got a beautiful example of, again, water coming off that tide pool or seaside pool. So we've got lots of beautiful blues in there as well, but we've actually got some nice contrasting yellows in there as well. So again, thinking of that color wheel and those contrasting tones, it's a pretty good use of those as well. And because the blue hue that's created during civil twilight, it's also quite a good time for moon photography as well. Then we move to nautical twilight. So the sky begins to darken considerably and the horizon line can be distinguished, and possibly even a few stars are starting to become visible there as well. So it's beautiful for cityscapes, as you can see here. So you're taking advantage of that artificial light, and a cityscape is going to give you beautiful results if we're looking at that as well. The dim sunlight also enables you to shoot for longer exposures without the use of a neutral density filter or an ND filter, if you haven't heard of those before. We'll talk a lot more about those in a little while. And again, due to that beautiful diffused and soft light, the landscape photography for this time of day is, again, a brilliant choice. Then we move on to astronomical twilight. So the sky becomes even darker again. The stars and planets become even more visible, although elements such as the nebula and galaxies might be a little bit difficult to observe within this particular moment. But once we go to full night, that obviously becomes a lot more prevalent. But now you can start doing night photography. So again, it's not just capturing astro, it's light painting. It's creating, again, all of those different elements within that darkened shot that you can have flexibility to do when you don't have as much ambient light. So note to always take, and this is actually a very, very good point, note to always take into account the moon phase, because during its second period of time, the sunlight can actually be replaced by moonlight. So you're actually going to have quite a bright scene purely because of the reflection of the moon and how bright that is. So as part of that app that I think Ash was asking about, definitely if you're looking to do things for astro or even at twilight, definitely pay attention to the moon phase at the same time. And then we move into full night time. So we've got completely darkened sky, and it enhances our ability to shoot stars or Milky Way. Quick funny story about this. So I shot this above my mum and dad's place in Bombo in Kiama, which is just south of Sydney. Never really done astro before. I had an 8mm 1.8 on my EM1 Mark II. and everybody had gone to bed. So I walked out the front, had a look around and went, oh yeah, that looks pretty cool. Oh yeah, that looks like part of the Milky Way. So took the shot, took it in RAW, processed it, and came out and went, oh yeah, that actually looks pretty good. Threw it onto Instagram, and my colleague at the time, Jack Ham, phenomenal astro and landscape photographer, said, man, that's wicked. Where did you catch that? Because I could see like the cityscape in the foreground and all that sort of thing. Oh, it's just above mum and dad's place at Bombo. He said, oh, how long did it take you to get that? I said, oh, what do you mean? He said, well, how long did you sort of plan to do that? I said, no, I walked out the front and sort of saw it. And he goes, I hate you. because to capture, really powerful either nebula or Milky Way shots, a lot of the time you do really have to plan and be considerate of time of year and that sort of thing. So, but it does lead me to a very good point, because this is not a big up of me. It's actually a really good point that don't get things right by accident, because then you can't replicate them. Because I couldn't even tell you I'm sure I could look it up from when I posted it, but I couldn't tell you what time of year this was. I wasn't really paying attention to what direction I was facing. So capturing things by accident can be great, but if you can't replicate it and you don't actually know how you did it, you're not very clever. And I'm not very clever because of this particular shot. So please keep that into consideration. Oh, look, nothing wrong with surprising yourself. But again, if you wanted to try to replicate this and do it even better the next time, you couldn't do it because I don't know how I did it the first time.
Yeah,
so
that's it.
So look, new moon phases are especially suited for night photography. Again, we don't have as much power of the moon that's going to either give us some light wash or anything like that, and also in particular capturing that Milky Way. So definitely things to be considerate of. Now, scattering. But we need to understand that we are at the mercy of the elements. So even if we don't, so we've got beautiful bright sunshine and that sort of thing. There's not too many clouds in the sky. There's actually a whole bunch of other elements that we need to be considerate of. So for example, on a clear day, there just aren't enough water particles or dust in the air to create a dynamic scattering, or, there's those beautiful sunrises and sunsets that we sometimes get. But that's actually why. And there's absolutely nothing that we as human beings can do to control that. So sometimes it's a little bit hit and miss. 5 a.m. or 4 a.m. starts obviously hurt when you get to location and you take your shots and it's just not as spectacular as it could have been. But again, that is what draws us into landscape photography, because we are a lot of the time at the mercy of the elements. So again, planning our shoot is incredibly important. So we need to shoot with the understanding of how the light will be scattered depending on the time of day. So we've already talked about sort of where our sun's going to be positioned in here, but here we've got some quick example shots of what we're actually going to be able to achieve in those particular moments. So as we pass golden hour, we're going into blue hour, then nautical twilight, and then all the way into night. So all different example shots, and again, all very considerate of the time of day that we're going to be looking to capture those. So next we move on to our compositional elements. So we're going to talk in more detail about lines, our objects, and patterns. And of course, grids and narrative. Now the narrative, again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on. I'm going to touch on a thing called the Gestalt Principles, but we would be here all night if I could do a whole presentation on those individually. And it'd probably be really interesting for some of the people who haven't ever heard of those before, and for the people that have heard it go, you've just wasted my time because I know all of this, or I've heard all of this stuff before. So I will touch on that, but again, I don't want it to dominate what we're talking about. So, okay. So lines have an emotional implication. It's very, very simple. So horizontal lines really offer us stability and order, whereas vertical lines indicate dignity or height or strength. Diagonal lines create division or tension. Curved lines create peace or a feminine or a beautiful feel, whereas zigzag lines create complete chaos. So here we've got a quick example. So again, this is captured by Carl over in South Africa, or in Botswana, I should say. You notice the repeated lines and also the change in colors of each of those lines as well. So those horizontal lines establish order, but it also makes that shot add depth and also a little bit of a level of interest that we might not have seen automatically there. So also of note, and I'll cover this in a little bit more detail in a second, is that had this image been captured by a wide angle lens, so this was captured with 40 to 150, those layers would appear a lot further apart. So I'm not going to tell you what lenses to go out and buy and that sort of thing as well, but we are going to talk about a little bit of hardware to something to be considerate of when we're shooting our landscapes that you might not have already considered. So here's a great example. So these were shot down at the Great Ocean Road by a photographer of ours called Peter Yan. As you can see here, by using that telephoto or that longer focal length lens, we're creating a compression in between those layers, and it really does create that nice separation of layers in between them because they appear slightly closer together because of that compression that the longer focal length creates. So whereas most of us wouldn't traditionally like to or even think about capturing a landscape scene with a longer focal length, it might actually be something that you can consider because it really does, again, creates a different level of interest and creates a completely different perspective that you would see if you're taking the same shot as everybody else when you were simply just using a wide angle lens. So this is because if you back away from the subject and you zoom in with your lens, it's because the distance between me and the subject changes, but the distance between the subject and its background changes significantly less. Okay, so also obviously to think about it from not a landscape perspective, but more from a portrait perspective. Again, we're creating that sense of shallow depth of field, but when we're doing it in landscape with that longer distance, we are actually creating that compressed image, or that layered landscape is what we like to call it. Whereas here on the other extreme, where you're shooting at something at a particularly wide angle, if you shot this with a telephoto lens, obviously you're not even going to be able to frame anywhere near as much within this shot. And yes, it would have created some layers in there, but I think you would have lost some of the depth within the shot because you did that. So again, I'm not going to tell you to go out and only shoot telephoto lenses. Be selective, or have something that gives you a bit of a zoom range coverage, so that way you can sort of have the best of both worlds as well. So, but quick one on the way that wide angle lenses create that distortion called foreshortening. It pushes distant objects further away. Okay, so this is just a quick little thing that I want to show you guys. So here, if we're shooting with a wide angle lens, here we're going to have a subject in the foreground, but it's actually pushing that subject in the background to create an unrealistic distance between the background elements. So whereas a telephoto lens creates a distortion called compression, which pulls distant objects closer in, and hence why those things appear to be closer together because of that compression. So the camera's subject distance has changed, but the camera background to distance has changed relatively less. So what we're actually going to see is this sort of perspective. Okay, so the resulting telephoto image would look something like this, and creating that an unrealistic distance between the subject and background image. But again, it's all about perception and perspective, and that's how simple it is to change that simply by changing your focal length. Pardon me 1 second, folks. I'm going a bit dry.
Yeah.
Okay. So here it becomes a little less obvious because the foreshortening making the background seem further away, whereas the opposite occurs when we've got a tele lens. So again, just another example of what we're talking about there. So you can use this for things like cityscapes, sand dunes, as well as famous structures as well. So again, thinking about simply changing your focal length can have a really, really big impact on the way that your image is going to be perceived because of either that foreshortening or compression. Couple of different lenses there that will obviously be able to achieve that for you, or equivalent focal lengths depending on the system that you obviously shoot with. Horizontal lines, these are a biggie. So horizontal lines appear everywhere in nature as well as architecture, and often we can't capture them as we see them because of the light or the focal length, or particularly the field of view by that. But we can correct these later with editing software. But sometimes the lens distortion created by a wide angle lens can actually be desirable, as you can see here. Okay, next, curved lines. So we're often called leading lines, or a style of leading lines. These curved lines offer that meandering, either man-made or completely by nature. But it makes our way slowly through the image. So again, we've got something manufactured here because we've got a multi-tiered sort of pool or water feature. But as you sort of meander your way through there, it does actually feel sort of nice and calm and peaceful. Whereas again, you take an example like this where you're adding a little bit of a thrill element in there by throwing this guy here on the skateboard. And from what Chris told me, that's actually quite steep. So he was probably going like the clappers as well. But what is quite cool about this is that you've got that leading meandering line through there. But we're also going to talk about a little bit of the narrative of that is, okay, where is this going? Where is this guy going to end up on his skateboard? Because he is going to be doing a reasonable clip as he goes down through there. So again, we're taking a couple of those different compositional elements and the thought processes that we have, purely to make something a little bit more interesting than if we didn't even have that person in there. Diagonal lines, often leading lines, are very good at directing the focal point of our eyes. If the diagonals are jagged, we do feel a little bit of tension and chaos with them. But one thing that our eye actually likes, and this is purely subconscious, is triangles. So people like to have a starting point, a moving point, and then back to the original point. It's actually a very easy and simple way that subconsciously we process things. So when you're talking about things like mountains, obviously it's very easy to create a sort of a triangle pattern out of those. But what you'll actually find, a lot of good classical art also use deliberate triangles for points of reference and actually guide people through their image because of the use of triangles. Then obviously we can use objects to create context, as we've talked about a couple of times already. But these should be positioned on our cross points if we are particularly using the rule of thirds to allow that harmony or that balance within our image. Again, great way to use objects, again, is to add to that narrative. So again, we're talking about context. So here we've got a beautiful flare that we've got in there as well. But again, showing the context of how big that rock is and how wide that scene is purely by putting a subject in there. And your subject doesn't have to be a person. It's just something that we very easily subconsciously relate something to, because we can sort of get a feel for how big that's going to be compared to a person. So lines, shapes, objects, and colors, we see them everywhere and we use them as design elements in our photography. But when we duplicate and repeat them, we create patterns. And patterns can sometimes breathe life into our landscape. So again, great example of some beautiful orchards or vineyard. They can be naturally occurring. So again, using that beautiful cracking through the drying soil, or we can use them with photographic skill. So again, we can utilize the things like light painting or slower shutter speed photography. Big thing right now is aerial photography. So when I say aerial, it's not just using drones and that sort of thing. It's anything from an elevated position. So either think lookouts or anywhere you can get that different perspective on something. So I was lucky enough to help out the AIPP, so the Australian Institute of Professional Photographers, for one of their or the Aperture, so their national show a couple of years ago, and I print handled for them. And the amount of people that were capturing images within that aerial landscape subject matter was probably 2 times bigger than every other category that was in there apart from portraiture. So it's not just something that is growing, it is already absolutely massive. And I think the reason why it's so interesting, because again, it's a completely different perspective on things. A couple of guys over in WA that are award-winning for this, they create these patterns through coastal shots that they're taken from such a height that they look like oil paintings. They look like expressionist paintings. They don't actually look like nature. And when you realize that they're actually naturally captured, it makes them probably even more beautiful and interesting. So again, just having that elevated position can completely change the way that something is perceived. So next, and I'm going to quickly flick through these because I'm sure most of you have heard of these before. So we're going to talk about the golden rules, and I hate the word rules because we always want to, is it Picasso that said, learn them like a pro so you can break them like an artist? Mm-hmm. But it is kind of important to understand what some of these rules are, but also why they exist and why they work. So all of these different ratios, even blocks and identical triangles and all that sort of thing, some of them rely on mathematical progression, but they are guides. So keep them as guides only and then try to get a little bit more funky and interesting from there. So simple one that we're going to start with, rule of thirds. So most of us will have seen this before. So ideally what we want to do is put our points of interest on those intersection points where they cross over. But this is actually a really good time to talk about that change of angle or perspective. Because a big mistake a lot of people make, especially when they're shooting water, is to put that horizon line of the water smack bang in the middle of the shot. Now, what you've done is you've started taking what I call landscape passport photos. It's like putting your subject of every element smack bang in the middle of the shot. It's just the worst thing that you can do because, again, there's no balance, and unless something's really interesting, it's filling the frame, it's really not where you want to be positioning any sort of element, let alone when we're using the rule of thirds. So one of the things that the photographer with this particular shot needed to make was, am I going to prioritize the sky and sort of pitching back up, or am I going to prioritize the water or the sea, depending on what was happening there? So because we had those beautiful bursts of color and ray beams coming through the cloud, obviously that was a no-brainer because there's obviously nothing particularly interesting happening at the bottom of our screen. But we still want to show that we're taking this over the sea or over the water. So depending on what was happening above this shot, you probably didn't want to pitch any further up there because it would have given us probably the exact amount of sky that you would to the rule of thirds. But I think even with the way that it's been shot here, it still looks really, really beautiful because of that subject of interest that we've got there through the rays bursting through the sky there. So, but there is, psychologists suggest, and I just say suggest, is that the eyes and mouth exist in a face, and these are connecting points. So our brain can easily make that connection when we're looking at subjects through art or through landscape photography, and that's why that rule of thirds grid sort of works to our brain. Again, keep focal points on those intersection lines. How boring would this have looked if the lighthouse was done smack bang in the middle of the shot? Again, no balance, no harmony. We've just got, again, a landscape passport photo, and that's the last thing that we want to do. Now, next we call it the golden ratio because it is actually a progression based on the Fibonacci sequence of numbers. So I'm not going to go through all the math through it, but this golden ratio is very much based on a ratio of A divided by B equals 1.618. Now, it is very deliberately used in design, as you can see. There's a couple of examples here. So the Nat Geo logo and also the Apple logo. But it actually exists in nature, and maybe that's why we like it, or our brains subconsciously like it so much. So we see it in storms, shells, flowers, and obviously deliberately through art. It's actually very commonly used, and you may not have even realized that it was used, but once you actually see it overlaid, it actually makes a lot of sense. So, for example, if we measure our navel to the soles of our feet and then to our heads, the ratio is 1.618. If we do the ratio of our pinky to our middle finger, 1.618. It's uncannily scary about how this actually works, but it does work. And if you don't believe me, test it out. So it really is, apart from that particular sort of numbered sequence, it's hard to explain why it works. But once you actually apply it to really good art or really good images, you'll actually see that ratio does work really, really nicely. Then we've got center composition. So center composition, somebody once said, center composition is like roasting a chicken. Anybody can do it, but only a few can do it exceptionally well. And the reason why that is the case is that anything is off by an iota. It's actually the first thing that your eye is drawn to, because we're looking for that symmetry. And as soon as that symmetry is not there and not exact, your eye is actually drawn to the floor. Okay, I'll show you what I mean. So looking at this shot here, so over at Tokyo near the Sky Wheel, all of these beautiful converging lines and everything, and this shot was completely ruined because it's off by about a degree.
Yeah.
And if you, the first thing that you look at this shot is you're sort of drawn to the hump in the center there where it's not perfectly centered, and that throws the whole rest of the image out, because you can see that it's not perfectly centered against the sky tower, and then the whole balance gets thrown out purely because of that one thing. So, and that was down to laziness. So that was, again, this is my colleague Carl. So, and he put this in here deliberately, purely to show that this was actually completely ruined because he wasn't paying as much attention as what he should have done. It's also incredibly difficult because, especially in a scene like this where you've got so much going on, that you one alignment in this direction might have thrown something completely out for your pitch or your yaw. So you've got to be incredibly patient, but accuracy is absolutely imperative when we are looking at that sort of symmetry. Golden triangle, I'm not even going to spend time on that because I actually personally don't believe in it. But okay, one little touch thing here on narrative. So if you haven't heard of the Gestalt Principles before, it really does make a lot of sense once you actually read into it and you start actually critiquing images based on some of these mindsets, I suppose, in these different subject matters. So, but basically these theories try to explain the way that our brains perceive things. Okay, and it's all mostly done completely subconsciously until you actually understand and know what these things are. So the Gestalt principle, so at bare bones, it's the whole exists independently from the component parts. But then each of those subjects falls into either figure ground, similarity, continuance, or negative space. Now, again, I could spend the whole rest of the night talking about all of these. I'm just going to plant this seed with everybody. And if you haven't heard of this before, and if you want to know more about it, simple Google is going to give you a whole bunch of information around this, but it really will take your brain to a different level as far as when you're looking at images, or maybe even helping you understand why you like particular images because of some of these points. So that's where I'm going to leave that, because otherwise, again, we're going to be here all night. How are we going for time? Okay, cool. I'm almost there. Okay, so filters and files. So we'll quickly talk about the different filters that we can use when we're shooting landscape. So grad filters, polarizers, NDs, and then we'll talk about raw shooting, shooting in RAW versus JPEG file type, and then even capturing high resolution images if your camera's capable of it. So quick thing on grad filters. So grad filters are 100% a landscape photographer's friend. And what these do is help you balance the light intensity in one half of your shot. So think sky, ground. We want to manufacture something with our sky, so that's where we put the heavily filtered area, and then obviously it drops off, so we're not filtering out what is in the bottom of our scene or our ground. So typically used for skies, but they can actually be flipped on their head to create some pretty interesting things depending on what's going on your sky or in your foreground. But again, incredibly important. I think the physical filter is incredibly important to this. A lot of this stuff you can actually replicate in Lightroom, Photoshop, and that sort of thing. But the number one rule that I was taught when I first started learning photography was get it right in camera. So that way you can take that raw image, you can enhance it, you can do whatever you need to do afterwards. But I think people are becoming increasingly reliant on the post-processing as opposed to the skill and getting those competencies right in camera before you even capture the shot or as you're capturing the shot. So using grad filters for exactly that reason are obviously a great way to change that contrast and even some of the colors of sky depending on the scenario. Next, we've got polarizing filters. So most of us wouldn't go away on holidays without polarizing sunglasses. They improve our vision, they reduce fatigue, glare, obviously, and eliminate reflections. So if you're going on holiday with those for your face, you definitely want one of those for your camera. So polarizing filters, they do reduce the reflections in a scene, so it helps you see through water as opposed to just the top surface of water. They can also be used really nicely for street photography, so if you're shooting through glass or to eliminate reflections and that sort of thing. So it can reduce not only the reflections, but it can potentially add contrast and saturation to your color. One little tip that I will give you on these as well, especially once we move on to circular grad filters, circular ND filters, or any filter actually for that matter, is be extremely careful of the color that they may cast to your image. And what I mean by that is that, and it generally happens in the sort of the less expensive range of them, they'll have a little bit of a color cast to them. So they're quite often a little bit tinged towards cyan or green, or sometimes potentially towards blue. So be really, really careful of your starting point. And if you're lucky enough, you've got a mirrorless camera, you can see all of that happen before you even start. But if they do throw a particular tint or hue at you, you can either make that color adjustment through white balance within your camera, or you may need to make some saturation adjustments to it as well. But if you're shooting raw, yeah, you can tweak it later. But again, it's just being cognizant of what's going on in your camera before you even capture the image. So again, really, really simple. It's blocking out sort of certain wavelengths in order to be able to achieve that vision, not just for your eyes, but when you're using sunglasses, but obviously when we're using that physical filter on our camera lens as well. So the polarizing filter only allows either horizontal or vertically polarized light through. That's what it's actually doing. Next, we move on to neutral density filters. So probably the most heavily used within landscape photography, because at bare bones, again, it is probably closer to real sunglasses for our camera because it darkens that original scene and it allows our camera to shoot for a longer shutter speed. So whether we're trying to capture sensation of movement, so again, rivers and streams and waterfalls are obviously a beautiful example of that. But even when you're wanting to shoot for a longer period of time, just to let your exposure develop and get some more light in your darkened areas without blowing out your highlights, that's what a neutral density filter is going to give you. Okay, so if your ambient light is going to be a little bit brighter, it just gives us a darker starting point. So these are the sorts of things that you can capture purely because your camera can shoot with a longer shutter speed. So that was a 4-second exposure. This is cheating a little bit because this was shot with live neutral density filter in an Olympus camera, which I'll talk a little bit about later.
Yeah, I do notice that.
But again, using your ND filter or your neutral density filter is just a different way of balancing out your exposure triangle. Off topic slightly, but is also relevant because obviously people are shooting more and more video now. Neutral density filters are actually brilliant for video. And the reason why they're brilliant for video is that if you've never shot video before, getting that ratio between your frame rate and your shutter speed, or having your shutter speed double whatever your frame rate is, actually gives you nice motion blur. Now, if we're shooting video without a neutral density filter, but we want to have shallow depth of field, we can't shoot at 1.2 because obviously we're only shooting at a 50th of a second if we're shooting at 25 frames per second, which means that everything's going to be too bright. But that's where neutral density filters come into it. So it gives you that darker starting point, but that means you can also shoot with a shallower depth of field. So they're not just for landscape photography, so I thought I'll throw that in there as well. But anyway, back to the point.
Very generally useful too.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, if we want to use a longer shutter speed, it just means that we can stop the amount of light coming through with that neutral density filter. That's what its job is. So they don't polarize light. Instead, as I said before, they act like sunglasses for your camera to restrict the light. Obviously, different levels that you can get on there as well. Most people would sort of have somewhere around a 16 or a 32 in their kit. One really good tip, especially if you're budget conscious, is to buy one large one and then buy step-up rings. So that way you can attach that different filter to different step-up rings or step-down rings, depending on the lenses that you're going to use it for. That means you've got one filter to cover multiple lenses. Or if you're taking it a lot more seriously, you may use drop-in filters, or you're going to have specific filters for specific purposes. But there's a basic range of what you're going to be able to achieve. And if you want to know more information about filtering in general, please catch up with the guys at CameraPro because they are going to be able to sort of steer you in different directions based on what your requirements are going to be.
Yeah, definitely. Just on that last picture you had there, what's your view on the variable NDs?
Yeah, that was actually what I was trying to get out of my mouth before. Was a variable NDs. Again, they're probably the biggest culprit for color cast.
Yep.
So they can throw your colors out quite a bit. Yes, they do a good job. But I think if you are really going to take it seriously, you'd actually get yourself something that was a little bit more fixed, purely because a fixed one is always going to do a better job than something that's going to be variable. So think of it, jack of all trades that's okay at everything, whereas if you get something specific to your need, you're always going to get a better result out of it. And also when you think about filters, think about what you're actually doing with a filter. You're putting it in front of the glass elements on your lens. The last thing you want is any inconsistencies or any degradation of that light that is going through your lens onto your sensor, and sometimes that's what can happen if you don't have the right filter for what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And
is that cool?
Asking it to block light as well. So,
absolutely right. Absolutely right. Okay, so Live ND, I've got to give this a plug while we're here because it is just awesome. So there's two cameras in the Olympus range that can do this, and the cool thing about it is not only does it give you the effect of a neutral density filter so you can actually shoot for a longer period of time, it actually shows you what it's going to look like before you actually capture the image. So I've got a quick little video on here of the way this actually works. Now, I shot this because I've been in lockdown. I had to shoot this of my computer screen, so that's probably why it looks a little bit weird. But what you've got here is going through each of the different filter types. So pay attention to the waterfall in the background and also the water cascading on your left. As we click through the different filter types on the actual camera, you can see the effect of that water changing quite considerably. Now, that is the cool part, is it actually shows you what this is going to be before you even capture it. So yes, it'll go all the way up to a 5-cycle or an ND32. I actually think the 16 is probably all you would need for here, because once you go past that, it actually starts to look too unnatural. But again, that's the choice that you make at the time, and that's what you have at your fingertips built into your camera. And the whole reason why that was developed was that most ultra-wide angle lenses have that big concave front element. So once you start needing to physically filter those, that's when you need a cowl and drop-in filters and all that sort of thing. And they can be very, very cumbersome, very expensive. Don't get me wrong, they give you brilliant results. And if you're okay with that complication, then by all means. But having something like this built into your camera obviously means you don't need to worry about that. And it also gives you that ability for every single lens that you shoot with. So some shots from Victoria Falls. Sorry, yep.
Yeah, sorry, Aaron. Sorry to interrupt, but for those who have not have done ND long exposure, if you don't know what it's going to look like ahead of time, you might be spending 5, 10, 20 minutes at a place trying to, shooting at different shutter speeds, trying to get it to look good, and knowing what it looks like ahead of time, it saves you so much time.
Oh, absolutely. It not only speeds up that process, but it also enables you to create real-time corrections to your shot as well, as opposed to sitting there, take the shot, wait for that to go back and review the shot and go, okay, no, my alignment wasn't right here, or I need to make an adjustment here, and da-da-da. You can do all of that before you even capture the shot. So yeah, it does streamline your thought process and your capture process massively. But by the same token, that if you've got the time, and again, we talked about patience, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going through those, those steps of, and especially if you're shooting for anything less than sort of 60 seconds, waiting 60 seconds for the exposure to develop and then having a look at it, that's not kind of a big deal. Whereas if you're shooting for extended periods of time, that's where it can get really tedious, especially if you get it wrong and then you've got to start all over again. That can be incredibly frustrating. So yeah, that's definitely a big benefit of having that built into camera. Absolutely. And just quickly flick through these guys, because you can see these are all different shots, all at different shutter speeds of Victoria Falls. And you can see that each of those individual shots are changing the flow of that water quite significantly. And that's all just using that built-in live neutral density filter.
And does the system work in conjunction with regular NDs as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because what your camera is reading is literally what the light that is coming through the camera. So the way live neutral density filtering in camera works is that it'll take whatever exposure time you select and then break it down into smaller increments based on the level of filter that you choose. So if you chose the ND32, it'll break that down into 5 different smaller increments. The party piece, again, is it's showing you what it's going to look like beforehand, but that's actually how it's achieving the exposure time, by breaking that exposure into smaller increments. You can obviously massively extend that time by doing that same process in camera and then throw an ND32 or an ND16 on the front of it as well. So it's incredible flexibility that you've got with that. And right now, the 2 cameras that have got that, the EM1X and the EM1 Mark III, that's first gen. Like, that doesn't exist in any other camera in the world. So I'm really intrigued to see how far they can push that sort of technology, because we've got similar types with, computational stuff with high resolution shot, as well as live composite and that sort of thing. So there's sort of variations on the theme, but it really probably just comes down to processing power of how much you can actually get the camera to do within a singular shot. So I have no doubt, like what has happened with a lot of the things that Olympus brought to the table, other people will probably copy it. But having said that, though, nobody's copied live composite the way that we do it yet. So they'll be interested to see when that actually does finally happen, because everybody loves live comp. So
it is a very useful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such good fun, and it still gives you the result, but without the tedium in between. Again, similar to the live neutral density filter. But anyway, let's stay on track, because I'm respectful of your time, because we've already gone slightly over time. Okay, so finally, RAW versus JPEG. So which one are you going to choose? So here we've got all of the sort of pros and cons from one file type to the other. And what I sort of say to people, especially when they're just starting out, whether it be within landscape photography or photography in general, do you have the skill set? Ask yourself the question, do you have the skill set and also the hardware or technology or software to be able to process your images from RAW? Because that's probably, in my opinion, probably the only real downside of shooting in a RAW file format. For those of you who haven't heard of that reference before, a RAW file is basically raw data, so unedited, uncompressed data that comes straight off your camera sensor and then put into a file on your SD card. And the reason why it can be tedious is that it's now our job as the photographer to take that card out of the camera, put that file onto our computer, put it into a software program, and then create that image from that RAW file to where we want it to be. So to put it into a JPEG so we can share it, or a TIFF to print, or whatever. But that can take time. And when you're really sort of just starting on your photographic journey, that processing becomes a big part of what you do. But as we've talked about, if you get all of these core competencies right, if you do all of these little things right to get as much right in camera as you can, there's absolutely nothing wrong with shooting JPEGs in your camera, because you're going to have that immediate result. You can do something with that file immediately. But again, it takes time and skill set to be able to be confident in that file that the camera is going to produce for you. Alternatively, what I very much suggest to people is when you're first starting out, or even if you're relatively experienced and you do have the software program and that sort of thing, if you've got your exposure and all the elements right in camera, shoot in JPEG and RAW, because that way you're going to have that beautiful JPEG the way the camera thinks it should be, but then you've also got the RAW file to enhance it after the fact. Okay, so it's actually the best of both worlds when it comes to that sort of setup. So alternatively, a lot of, well, pretty much all pros and all experienced photographers will specifically and exclusively shoot in RAW. But again, there are benefits to it because you get larger color gamut, you've got a wider range or larger dynamic range, so you can pull detail out of your shadows and highlights a lot easier. The files are slightly larger in RAW. So obviously a consideration that you need to have is card size and therefore how many shots you can fit within that card. But let's face it, SD cards and the like are so much cheaper than what they used to be. So having a range of cards or buying those cards that are a little bit larger, especially if you're going on a long holiday, it's probably not as difficult to do as what it might have used to have been. So think about it this way. RAW gives you complete control over the way you can manipulate the file to get it to the finished product, but it's up to you to do that. A JPEG, yeah, you're not going to have as much, excuse me, you're not going to have as much flexibility, and you're probably not going to really want to do much editing to a JPEG because a lot of that information's been pulled out through compression. But if your camera is capable and shoots good JPEGs, shoot in both so that you get the best of both worlds. And then as your knowledge and experience with processing your images changes, you'll probably find yourself shooting more in RAW exclusively.
Most of your high-end cameras these days also have a dual slot anyway, so you can generally shoot
Absolutely.
RAW to one and JPEG to the other.
Absolutely. So when we're doing shoots for work and that sort of thing, you'll have two cards in there, but you'll have both RAW, more from a backup point of view, just to make sure if something goes wrong with a card or whatever, you've got the shots. Whereas for family holidays and that sort of thing, where they're super important, but if you've lost a RAW or a JPEG, but you had the other, like it's not the end of the world sort of thing. But the advantage there is that you've got that JPEG to send out and share and all that sort of thing really, really quickly, because most modern cameras will have Wi-Fi and or Bluetooth built into them. So you can pair it with your phone or your iPad and you can instantly share all of those images as you capture them. Doesn't matter what brand it is, you can do all of that now. So, and that's probably the big advantage of having that JPEG available to you immediately as well. But to give you some examples, if you haven't seen this level of processing before, or this level of flexibility that a RAW file gives you, this is what we're talking about. So here's our starting point, whereas here's how we've been able to manipulate that RAW file. Now, we would not have had that level of flexibility if we were shooting in a straight JPEG. So if we go back to that there, so we've brought the shadows up on the castle, we've brought the highlights down within the sky, so we've got more detail within our clouds. We've enhanced the colors a little bit as well. It makes it a very cool shot. But again, the baked in information that would have been in that JPEG file would not have given us that level of manipulation if we needed to make a change to it later, if we didn't get it right in camera the first time. Again, that was the starting point for the Eiffel Tower shot that we looked at before. This is where we can take it to make that so much more interesting, so much more detail, both in our highlights and in our midtones and some of our shadows there as well. That is the benefit of shooting RAW, is to be able to take that file and push it and pull it the way that we need to. I'm not going to spend too much time on high-res shot, because high-res shot is, or computational in-camera photography, is something that exists on multiple cameras now. The Olympuses are cool because they actually put these images together for you in camera. You don't have to do it after the fact. But the EM1X and the EM1 Mark III can actually let you do this by hand as well, whereas traditionally you actually have it sit on a tripod, and the sensor would move sort of half a pixel with 8 times and then overlay all of that information into an 80 megapixel high res shot. So it sort of gives you the best of both worlds. But depending on the scenario, you may love to do it handheld because you want that better, more flexible and larger resolution file, but you might not necessarily have a tripod or have access to a tripod or have access to a space where you can get a tripod in, which is why you use high res. Getting towards the end here, guys, because again, I'm keeping my eye on the time because I don't want you guys to stay too late. HDR, or high dynamic range images or techniques, is definitely something that we want to talk about in a lot of detail, though, because as much as modern cameras are brilliant at capturing a lot of information in the highlights and shadows or high dynamic range shots from a singular capture, if you're in a really high contrast environment, so this church with stained glass is a perfect example, where we've got quite bright highlights coming through our window, and we've also got quite dark shadows that have been created through the walls and that sort of thing there. So if we were to do this as a singular capture, yeah, we could sort of push and pull the shadows and highlights from that one file a little bit, but it might still not get us to where it needs to go. So there's two ways we can do HDR shooting. So we can either do it with the inbuilt style that is in your camera already, and most cameras already have a HDR function. Basically what it'll do is once you turn it on, it'll take 4 different shots really quickly, all at different exposures, and then stick them all together and give you what the camera thinks is the best sort of amount of detail in the shadows and highlights, because it's got all that information from multiple shots. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Really, the only thing that you as the photographer have to choose from is your starting point. But because it's only 3 to 4 files, depending on the camera, it's not a great deal of more information in there. It's only a little bit more. So a better HDR technique is actually called bracketing. So you may not have heard of bracketing per se. Most modern cameras have multiple different types of bracketing that they do, but the big one that we're talking about here is exposure bracketing. Now, what we mean by exposure bracketing is sort of doing what we did with HDR, where we take multiple shots all at different exposures, but then what will actually happen is, say, for example, if I took 7 shots all at 0.7 of a stop apart, I'd have 7 individual RAW files, but then it's up to me to take those RAW files, put them into a computer program, and then have the computer program stick them together to create that high dynamic range shot. So if you need something sort of quick and on the fly, let the HDR inbuilt setting on the camera do the job for you. Again, sometimes it'll do a good job, sometimes it won't. I personally think that the inbuilt camera one, it doesn't matter which camera it is, because I've seen it on lots of different cameras, it makes it look a little bit fake, because I think the gaps in between each of the levels of brightness or luminance are a little bit too broad. That's why it's better to take multiple shots. And if you use the bracketing function that's built into your camera, that's probably the best way to do it. Otherwise, you can simply do it by hand and say, okay, I'm going to start at this exposure, and then start in the middle, and then say I'm going to take 4 shots, 1 stop each time, a little bit darker, and then I'm going to take 4 shots, 4 stops from that sort of starting point brighter. Then you've got 8 shots. Now you've got all those different shots where you can go, okay, take those shots, put them into your computer program software, and stick them all together and create that exposure bracketed shot. And what you will see is the amount of not just detail, but contrast, and the detail in those shadows and highlights will be like nothing you could ever capture out of a singular shot. And that's why that technique exists. So if you haven't experimented with bracketing with exposure before, they're probably the two best ways to start off with that. But again, just remember that you can't bracket in camera. You will need to turn bracketing on, go to exposure bracketing, set the amount of shots that you want, and also the distance and exposure in between each of them. And then it's up to you to take those shots and then put them into the program to edit afterwards.
That's right.
Here you've got a couple of examples. So here we've got a single capture and then taken with, an HDR. So there's 2 HDR settings, 1 and 2 in Olympus cameras. Here we've been able to pull all that beautiful detail out of the sky and still keep our colors. And also the detail within our shadows within the water there as well. So there's a good example of how it can work. Whereas HDR2, it actually uses a broader stop interval. 5 images were taken with this, again, at 2 stops apart. But then these had to be combined in the Aurora software. So these were done by my counterpart, Carl. And if we flick between those 2, again, you can see there's a significant difference in between what our single file was going to look like versus the HDR stacked file after the fact. So again, very, very important technique to landscape photography in particular, especially because 99% of the time we've got a static subject. So doing that where there's no variation or moving parts within the scene, that's how you're going to get the best results out of that. Okay, so a little bit of a summary, folks. So again, our journeys, differentiation and order, they're the goals that we have. And then when we're talking timing, we need to make sure that we remain patient. We want to pre-visualize and pay attention to the way that the light is being scattered, and our elements. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to our lines, our patterns, our grids, and the way that our narrative is forming and the way that we want people to perceive the image. And then we want to look at our filters and files. So the way that we're perceiving color, polarization and neutral density filters, and also the file formats that we're going to shoot in. And then we've got technique on top of that as well. So That's it from my official part of the presentation, guys. I haven't gone for too long, so hopefully we've got still plenty of time for Q&A. Again, I can go as long as everybody is happy to. So guys, would you like me to stop sharing my screen, or would you like me to leave this up?
Jump back onto your face cam.
Okay.
Right. So we're back.
Cool.
That was, quite a lot of information, but extremely relevant. And I don't feel like those, as you said at the beginning, they're all very deep rabbit holes.
Absolutely. And so apologies for anybody if there was a particular sort of point or subject in there that we didn't cover in probably the amount of detail that we could have. Again, if you go down one rabbit hole, you'll never be able to cover anything else. So and as I said right at the beginning, that doesn't mean that we can't do something a little bit more detailed in another future session as well if we do want to go down the rabbit hole on something in particular. But again, that's sort of the official part from what I've prepared for the evening, guys. Now I throw it over to you folks and any of the questions that you might have that we can cover.
Yeah, absolutely. If we might have maybe 10 minutes for questions. So if you guys are watching live, pop some questions in, and we'll get Aaron we'll all discuss it.
Yeah, we've got a few thank yous coming through. A lot of people have said great presentation, Aaron. So
thank you.
Thank you for that, firstly. And thank you guys for passing that on. We did have a few questions that we got in prior to the live stream. So I guess one of them is, to start off, how to do landscapes without a tripod?
Yeah, incredibly difficult, only if you're trying to capture subject movement or a slower shutter speed. So I'm not sure if you noticed through some of the presentation there were quite a few shots that were still captured at higher shutter speeds. Really, it's getting that balance right between making sure that the majority of your actual exposing in any camera is being done by your shutter speed. Think of your aperture controlling how much is going to be in focus within your shot. So, excuse me. So as long as you're getting that balance right where you're shooting at a high enough aperture number to get as much in focus within the shot, your camera's going to need to balance against that with its shutter speed to make sure that you get enough light let into the shot. So using a tripod is really only imperative for if you're trying to use a slower shutter speed. Using faster shutter speeds, and again, that comes down to your camera stabilization, how steady your hands happen to be, how much coffee you've had that day, all of that sort of thing. So please don't think that you can only capture beautiful landscape shots when you are sat on a tripod. Definitely not the case. You've just got to be aware of how much movement's going to be in your shot, and also if you need to stop motion to get that shutter speed up a little bit as well. So it's not just about slower, it's about making sure it's fast enough. So I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And I guess the next thing to look at, and you sort of touched on it throughout your presentation, but maybe just your personal opinion, best lenses to shoot landscapes with, because you obviously mentioned a couple of telephotos and then your wide angle, but what's your opinion there?
Look, I'm not going to give you complete detail on focal lengths and all that sort of thing, because that varies from one camera system to another and all that sort of thing. But realistically, I think if you can have in your kit all of the time something that's wide or an ultra wide, again depending on size and budget and all that sort of thing, and then maybe have a standard zoom in there as well. So the two that I sort of mentioned in the presentation earlier was a 7-14. So if you talk about that in sort of 35mm film terms, so that's a 14 to 28mm. Pretty much all brands have something within that sort of wide or ultra wide sort of range. Now, that lens I mentioned is an f2.8, so it is one of our pro lenses. It is weather sealed and it's brilliant, don't get me wrong, but it is a little bit more expensive because of that faster aperture. So what you might look at, and considering most of the time that we want as much in focus within our shot as humanly possible, the 2.8s aren't overly relevant for when we're shooting landscape. We actually don't care if they're f4 or even a 4 to 5.6 if there's a little bit of a zoom on it. So I would be just as aware of your budget and size as well as the focal length, because yes, you do get what you pay for when it comes to lenses, but that doesn't mean that you can't capture beautiful images as long as you know your gear and also know your lens. And what I mean by knowing your lens is that the more expensive lenses are really sharp throughout their whole zoom range, and also their aperture range. But every single lens, it doesn't matter what it is, has an aperture sweet spot. And what I mean by that is that basically from that particular F number and then probably up to F11, F16, depending on the lens, is where you're going to go absolutely edge to edge sharp. Now, that's generally, it's actually quite not far off wide open for Olympus stuff, but most lenses, especially even the really good ones, if it's a 2.8, your absolute sweet spot would probably be around F4 or 5.6. Yeah. So as long as that gives you the depth of field within that range where you know you're in your lens's sweet spot, that's actually probably what you really need to know more about what you've already got before you start sort of looking elsewhere or looking to upgrade or looking to reinvest and all that sort of thing. Master what you have and then start to look at, okay, can I achieve what I want to with what I've got? Yes or no? And then say, okay, cool. Well, I'll actually want to capture, bigger scenes or start taking panoramas and all that sort of thing. That's where obviously a wider angle is going to give you the ability to capture as much within your shot as humanly possible. But one technique that I was kind of hoping that this might come up in questions because I deliberately didn't put it in the presentation so we could talk about it afterwards. A really cool panorama tip that I got quite a while ago now is, and you will need a tripod for this, is to take your tripod. We're used to sticking a camera on there and having it shoot in a landscape sort of setup. Take your camera, put it on the tripod and throw it into portrait. And then what I want you to do is say your scene is running this way. I'm going to start over here and I'm going to put my finger inside the edge of the shot. So I'll put it in my camera there so you can see it there. Take my first shot and that's like a marker. So you go, okay, that's going to be, the next shot after the one with the finger in it is going to be the first shot. And then you take a shot, move the camera sort of half a frame, take the shot, move the camera half a frame, take the shot, move the camera half a frame. And then you take all of those images and you put them into, Lightroom, Photoshop or whatever, and then you put them together to create this massive pano. And the advantage you've now got is that you've got all this wiggle room to manipulate that file because you've not just got this strip here, you've actually got the height as well as the width, depending on the amount of shots that you take. So even if you don't have a really ultra wide lens to start off with, shooting panos with that technique actually is a great way to still get some width in your shot. But again, you've got to go through the rigmarole of, stitching and putting them together after the fact. So, but look, to get back to sort of really answer the question, one wide and one sort of medium zoom will pretty much do 99% of the job for what you're going to need for when you're shooting landscapes specifically.
Cool. And I guess if people are sort of finding out what they're used to shooting and what they quite like as a focal length, prime lenses are probably another good option as well, purely for the fact you don't have to pay for as much and generally you actually get a better aperture in your prime lenses, keeping the kit a little bit smaller as well.
Absolutely. The other benefit to using primes is, as you said, faster aperture, which means that they can become a lot more flexible as well. So that means you can not just use them for landscape, you can use them for astro, you can use them for portraiture or product photography, all of that sort of thing. Look, zooms are great because, but again, they're always going to be a little bit of a jack of all trades, whereas your primes, optically, they're usually a lot better throughout that whole aperture range. And as you said, they're a lot smaller as well. So if you're trying to keep your kit and your profile down and make it nice and light, that is definitely a great way to go. Yeah, I totally agree.
And I think one more point that you touched on there, which is really quite useful for landscape photographers especially, is an L bracket. So if you are looking to shoot portrait quite a bit, the L bracket for a landscape photographer is a must.
100%. Absolutely right.
Yeah, cool. And now, camera settings for day and night shooting. Do you just have a general settings that you set up when you go out?
Look, on my cameras, I've got like a couple of, and again, this is all going to be dependent on the camera that you have, but I've got 4 different custom modes that I can have on my camera. And instead of turning the mode dial, I've actually pre-programmed them all to different buttons. Excuse me, the hardest part is remembering what I've put onto each button. So once you sort of got your head around that, it's okay. But one thing that I found really useful if your camera does have that is you'll have something for daytime. And this is setting up everything from your baseline shutter speed, your aperture, absolutely everything. You can literally either click the mode dial into that custom mode or assign it to a button and press that button, and it's going to give you that starting point. And the reason why I say that starting point is that because you need to be situation aware. If you're shooting at night, it all depends on, are you trying to capture stars still, or are you happy for them to blur and all that sort of thing? So one thing, if you're talking about nighttime photography in particular, look up a thing or a subject called the rule of 500. It gives you a full description of what focal lengths you're going to be able to shoot for, or the time you can shoot a particular focal length for before the stars start to move and start to bleed or start to blur. The reason why I mention that is because, again, it's completely unique to the focal length that you're going to be using on your particular camera. So if you're happy for the stars to blur, again, it doesn't make a difference. If you want to capture a pure astro shot with stars not moving, you need to be very aware of that rule. Apart from that, what I'd probably suggest to people, for if you're not confident in using the manual function on your camera, hopefully you will get there, because it will give you total control over the camera. And once you become more confident, it's all muscle memory. Once you start sort of knowing what you're doing with it, it all becomes second nature. That's why it's so hard for people to change cameras, because you get sort of in this zone where you can sort of go, okay, I need to do this, and you can do it with your eyes closed. Or the alternative is get yourself a mirrorless camera so you can actually see it all happen in front of you. You can see actually what's changing, or whether it's not just the exposure, but you can also set buttons to show depth of field preview and all that sort of thing. So really, again, think about what you're trying to achieve. So if you wanted to set up a night scene, then really you'd probably be looking at, somewhere within, and again, another variable is, do you have a tripod? So if you've got a tripod on there, then obviously you can shoot for a much longer shutter speed without having to boost your ISO. Whereas if you don't have a tripod, then you're probably going to have to boost your ISO a little bit just so you can get the shutter speed that you need to. But then you're probably going to have to boost your shutter speed, your ISO even bigger to be able to enhance the amount of light that you've got available to you in the sky. So what I'd probably recommend you do, and I touched on it very briefly, I didn't really spend a lot of time on it right now, is a thing called the exposure pyramid or the exposure triangle. If you've not done research on that before, I highly encourage you to, because it basically talks about the relationship between your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. So the three key ingredients of the way that you're going to manipulate your camera. But otherwise, that'll probably give you an idea of why I don't want to say, well, you should use a 25th of a second or a 500th of a second. There's just way too many variables to it. But from a camera technique point of view, to give yourself a starting point, use those custom modes and actually literally start at a particular shutter speed, just so you don't go, the last time I used my camera, I was shooting birds and they were really fast moving and I had lots of light available to me and my shutter speed was an 8,000th of a second. So you get to a scene, you turn your camera on, and then you've got to go from an 8,000th all the way down to 3 seconds. It doesn't take that long, but again, if you haven't given yourself a big window to capture, then you might miss the opportunity. So instead of just pressing a button and going, okay, well, that's my night scene mode starting point, which is like set to a second or something like that.
Yeah, and the caliber of your camera really matters as well. Generally.
Oh, absolutely. And I loop right back to what I said right at the beginning. Know your camera. Know what it can do, know what it can't do, and then obviously that builds into what your lenses are capable of and what you want them to achieve. And this is going to sound like a sales push. I swear to you it's not. Don't just think about what I know, but what I mean by that is that when you're going to buy your next lens, don't just think about what you're trying to do now. Future-proof yourself. What sort of photos am I looking at right now? What's actually really capturing my eye? And if I haven't actually tried any of that stuff, is my next purchase going to be able to give me the ability to potentially do that in the future? So just think big before you make that sort of purchase. But what I will say is, once you've got a good lens, it doesn't matter what focal length it is, you'll love it, and you'll actually make it work. The lens because I'm using an EM1X on my webcam for this, and I use the 17mm 1.2 on this exclusively. It's brilliant. I love this lens. But recently in our roadmap, the 20mm 1.4 got announced, and I can't wait to get my hands on that because it's even smaller. So I'll probably throw that on an EM1 Mark III with no battery grip on it, and now you've got something that's completely nondescript and obviously super light, but it's still a 1.4, so you can make it flexible with all the stuff that you can do with it. Cool. Was there any other questions?
Roger. We'll go two last questions we've got. So Roger's asked, any basic tips for starting astro?
Starting astro, okay, cool. So I take that one step back to knowing your camera And the big part of knowing your camera for astrophotography is how far you can push your ISO. So it doesn't matter what camera system you use. Everybody's got a cleanish sort of or recoverable noise window. Newer cameras, even the high megapixel ones, are still really, really good at controlling noise, and a lot of that's down to sensor construct as well as processing and all that sort of thing. But know what your camera is capable of from an ISO point of view, and also what you find acceptable. Because depending on the shot, I actually don't mind a little bit of grain in there. Whereas if you've got too much grain in an astro shot, it takes away from your stars. It actually ends up ruining your shot, which is a tough one, because generally your astro shots is one of the scenarios where you've really got to start pushing your ISO. So that'd be my first tip, is knowing and understanding what your camera's capable of from an ISO point of view, and then working within that window. Because the boost in ISO means that you don't have to shoot your exposure for as long, which means that you don't have to use as wide a focal length in order to capture the stars not moving and all that sort of thing as well. So know and understand your ISO. Secondly, get yourself a really good tripod. And the third thing would be the app that we talked about very briefly before about weather conditions and that sort of thing. There's one for Astro, which my colleague Jack used to use all the time, and he raved about it. But do a little bit of a Google search on times of year for Astro, and also the shape direction that you'll have based on the direction that you're facing. So what I mean by that is that, if I remember correctly, if you're facing south when you're shooting stars, you'll get the nice big circles. Whereas if you're shooting either north or in another direction, I can't remember which, you'll just get the blurs where they sort of curve across the sky. So little things like that you can very easily research based on where you are as well. But unfortunately, coming out of winter, we're sort of out of our Milky Way period for Astro. Yeah. So you'll have to wait until next year if you wanted to do that, or get the best possible results, I should say.
We might actually follow up later and actually put the link in the comments section after the videos.
Yeah, that'd be great.
On YouTube.
Now,
a couple of people have mentioned photo pills, so that might be one as well.
Okay. Yeah, cool.
Okay, cool. And final one, nice and quick for you. Focus. What do you suggest, manual or autofocus?
Again, it's kind of camera dependent. The first thing that I would definitely say is make sure you're not accidentally using continuous focus. So that's the first one. Secondly, again, knowing your camera system and knowing your camera lens and that sort of thing, and also the aperture range that you're using as well. One little tidbit that we could have gone into, again, a massive rabbit hole tonight, is about hyperfocal distance. It's incredibly important for landscape photography, but it's also, again, can be a really long-winded conversation. But it also applies to astrophotography. So let me give you the really sort of short version of this. Every single lens and every single aperture has an absolute bang-on perfect focus point or focus distance at a particular distance. But what actually happens with hyperfocal distance is from that point, from that absolute focus point, you've got about a third just forward of that point that is acceptably in focus. And then you've got 2/3 of that total range that is behind that point that is acceptably in focus. Now, our eyes can't sort of determine that once it gets to a certain distance, because, as you guys know, the further away you focus from yourself, the bigger that sort of range of what is in focus is going to get. And also, the higher the aperture number that we use, or the higher the aperture reference number, I should say, that we use, you're actually expanding your depth of field with that as well. So when you're shooting things like Astro, one little tip that I'll give you is, if your lens has a manual focus ring on it with an infinity symbol on it, a lot of people will just go, okay, cool, I'm shooting Astro or stars or the moon or whatever. I'll just throw it straight into the middle of that infinity loop, and that means that everything's going to be bang on from there. It's actually not quite the case. So what I would highly recommend you do, based on that hyperfocal distance of 1/3 forward and 2/3 behind where that sort of perfect focus point is, space is infinite. Therefore, anything past that focus point, or that absolute focus point, is always going to be in focus. So you're actually better off being slightly forward of that point. So again, if you've got that infinity symbol, that loop on your lens, put your focus point halfway through the first loop. So not the second loop and not in the middle, halfway through that first loop. And you'll probably find that you'll get better results on the back of that. The second thing in regards to Astro would be to use focus peaking. And focus peaking, I don't believe exists on any SLR models. It's pretty much a mirrorless thing. But if you haven't seen focus peaking before, basically what it does is give you a color shaded area that actually comes up on your camera screen or in your viewfinder that shows you where you're focused, and it does work on stars. So that's actually a really cool and easy way, if your camera has that as a guide, to manually focus. Because for Astro, it's really hit and miss if you're using autofocus. Whereas landscape photography, that's where that hyperfocal distance probably comes a little bit more into it, where you probably want to focus at, say, f8, f9, f10, probably about a third of the way through the scene, because that way everything before that point is going to be perceived as in focus, and then everything behind that is going to be in focus because of that hyperfocal distance. Alternatively, if you really want to get funky, then the next step would be focus bracketing. So focus bracketing, or sticking images together that are all shot at different layers of focus. I think a lot of people perceive that as just for stuff with macro, because again, the closer you get to something, the skinnier that plane of focus or that depth of field is going to be. But it's actually a great way to get super sharp landscape images. So you'd literally say, okay, either pick yourself points or do it in terms of your focus ring and that sort of thing, and take multiple shots of exactly the same scene, throw them into your editing software, and they can perform a focus bracket for you. So instead of each of those shots only having a certain amount of that image being in focus, by combining all of those images, everything is going to be perceived as in focus and nice and sharp. Whereas, the one last thing is that you can still do all of that with manual focus. Again, you just manually focus your way through there. But again, as long as you're using an aperture that's high enough, again, easy way to do it is focus about a third of the way through your scene. As long as your F number's high enough to give you that broader depth of field, you'll be right most of the time.
Cool. Yeah, that's some great information.
Awesome. There's a lot in there.
But I need a drink.
Well, guys, you guys are welcome to watch it again.
That's it.
In case there's anything you on this.
Just as we were wrapping up, we do have, thanks to Olympus, we have been able to secure a couple of specials. Now, we've got in-store vouchers on a few models. And so at the moment, we've been lucky enough to have a $200 in-store voucher when you purchase an OMD EM1 Mark III. We've got $150 on the M5 Mark III, $100 on the M10 Mark IV and Mark III. So if you buy any of them up until October the 17th, which is this Sunday, you will get one of those in-store vouchers. Now, obviously, if you can't make it in store, we're happy enough to use over the phone as well. So it's not for the same transaction, it will be for the following. And we've also got to mention that the EM1X has a $500 cash Visa card, and that's running, when's that running till again, Aaron?
That runs until the end of the month.
End of the month.
No, end of November.
I thought it may have been extended there, yeah. I just didn't want to say, just in case.
Yeah, so actually no, it was extended from September until the end of October. Yeah, so it's the end of this month.
We'll go with October.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's the end of October. Yeah, it is the end of October, sorry.
All right, well, we're going to have to say thank you very much, Aaron. That was brilliant. And thank you to everyone
my pleasure,
for tuning
folks.
in.
Thank you so much to CameraPro for helping pull this together, guys. It's been absolutely brilliant. Really appreciate it. And for everybody who joined us this evening, a big thank you for joining us as well. And look, stay tuned for what the guys from CameraPro are doing for you as well. We want to do more events with them, and we're slowly coming out of lockdown as well. So hopefully maybe even a face-to-face session sometime in the near future as well. I'm really pumped about coming up and seeing you guys.
We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Brilliant. All right, thank you so much, guys. And thanks again for tuning in.
Cheers.
All right.
Cheers. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye. That's it.